No Man's Sky is evolution manifest. Ever since its first release, which drew complaints from unsatisfied players everywhere, Hello Games have worked to expand and improve their infinite universe. The barren, repetitive planets that caused its initial reception became more alluring with each patch, leading all the way to a well-received VR update as I record this podcast. It's a living proof of the ever-changing nature of games today, and their ability to grow with community feedback. Years on from its debut, No Man's Sky has won awards for its dedication to restoring public faith, and it backs that up in its gameplay. So what exactly is No Man's Sky? Ambitiously, it aims to present an entire universe of 18 quintillion individual planets, each populated with their own unique ecosystems and resources. Through the player's journey of discovery, you're tasked with trading, exploring, fighting, and building your way to the centre. Your sense of scale is warped as you effortlessly fly from the atmosphere of a world into the vast dark of space, before hyperdriving your way to the next solar system without breaking a sweat. All the while, the action and ambience of No Man's Sky is scored by 65 Days of Static, a post-rock and electronic band who took their first steps into a new industry for the project. While the actual game took some time to reach its potential, 65 Days of Static's soundtrack was extremely well received from the beginning. By melding the band's sound with experimental procedural elements, they were able to perfectly reflect the title's own generative nature, and find fresh ways to adapt their songwriting in the process. They were helped along the way by the experience of Paul Weir, a producer and composer with a rich history in game audio. As No Man's Sky's audio chief, his efforts are invaluable to how 65 Days of Static's music is presented to the player. Additionally, he took on general sound design, where he really let his talent shine through outlets like creature vocals, which again use procedural elements, allowing for much greater individuality in the game's wildlife. I'm Lee Tyrrell, and this is the Sound Test, where I look in depth into video game audio and music, along with the very people who crafted it. This week, I'm joined by Paul Weir.
Can you hear me okay?
And another Paul W, 65 Days of Static's Paul Wolinski.
How you doing?
For a focused episode about No Man's Sky. It's a game I once disregarded myself, but after recently falling in love with its updates and gladly changing my mind, I grew eager to hear more on its inspired aural atmosphere. Firstly, and most obviously, contracting an established band to write the soundtrack for a game is extremely rare. There are, of course, exceptions, but most VGM is handled by lone specialists, or occasionally, teams of composers who work separately. Since Paul Weir, a composer in his own right, was attached to the project from its early development, when did 65 Days of Static come on board? And what sparked their inclusion?
It was quite early on, but there was quite a gap between us sort of getting involved tentatively and actually starting work on it. Whenever they were getting their launch trailer ready, whatever year that was, it feels like about a decade ago now, they got in touch with us to use one of our songs called Debutante from an old record as the launch trailer. And so we got a bit of a dialogue going with them, asked to see some more, get some more info about the game. And as soon as they sent over some concept art and explained the idea behind it, it was just immediately, compelling and interesting. And so we basically said, by all means use our song. If there's no one to do the soundtrack yet, then we should talk more. I met Sean Murray, the director of the game, and that was a really nice meeting because we really wanted to do some soundtrack projects, and I went to that meeting really trying to sell 65 to them, and it turned out that he was going to that meeting trying to sell No Man's Sky to 65 because he was a big 65 fan too, which was really nice, and basically the only reason that we got asked in the first place.
Well, Sean was, from the beginning, very keen to get 65 Days of Static involved. He was a great fan of their work. And we didn't want to force them into a way of writing music that they're not used to doing. They have a signature sound, they work well as a band, why disrupt that? I guess the challenge was let them work in a way they're comfortable working, create music in a way they create music, but somehow kind of engineer it so that work could also function in the game.
Sean Murray, who headed up No Man's Sky's development from its earliest conception, is known to have asked 65 Days of Static to write essentially a new album, largely out of his own love for the band. Indeed, it would make little sense to contract them based on their previous material, only to demand a wildly different sound. The group's signature guitars, warm synths, and frenetic drums were already a perfect match for the game's atmosphere. But how did 65 Days of Static feel about the idea of producing their next natural LP for No Man's Sky?
It was flattering and a bit confusing in equal measure, I guess, because and this was a little bit later, but we started going to more meetings, and we met Paul Weir, who was the audio director of the game, and before we'd had a big sit down all together, we were kind of imagining lots of possibilities, because we had no idea at this point, did they want us to score for an orchestra, or did they want it to be very sci-fi, or they wanted us to kind of write as if there was an orchestra, even though there wouldn't be a budget for one. It was all these kind of different possibilities that we were thinking about. But in our heads, it was always scoring, which seems very different to us than writing our own music. So when they said that, it was just okay, well that's cool, but we didn't really know at first how to write 65 Days of Static music, because we always approach albums trying to do something new and do something different, and whether they end up sounding like that or not, that's always in our heads, and so we've never really tried to repeat ourselves. Also at that time, the music we were making, the directions that we were heading in as a band was a little bit more experimental, a little bit abrasive, you could say, or noisy. And so subsequent conversations with Sean made us kind of understand that they wanted us to write 65 Days of Static record, but it was a certain type of 65, which was a type that we were kind of not doing so much, which is the sort of more melodic, kind of grand chord progressions and big loud kind of delayed guitars and stuff. And so because we've been starting to sort of tentatively move away from that, it was an interesting challenge to kind of learn how to simultaneously retread old ground but not slip into nostalgia or laziness or kind of make it boring for ourselves because it felt like music that we'd already made, if you see what I mean.
Sean Murray's request for a new 65 Days of Static album, as opposed to a more traditional score, had a profound impact on the band's mindset. Not only would their work on the game be released as a connected OST, but the actual LP, Music for an Infinite Universe, was approached as an official part of their ongoing discography. That put certain limits on the directions the band could go in, since the music needed to work just as well in isolation and satisfy existing fans.
I think as soon as Sean asked us to write a 65 Days of Static record, I think that was a much bigger thing in our head than it might have occurred to him at the time, because it's one thing to be a band that does soundtracks or scores, and if you do that, somehow you've kind of got your canonical releases, like your proper albums. That's a bad way of putting it, but the 65 standalone albums, and then the projects, the other soundtrack projects, might run in parallel to that or off to the side. But it doesn't quite. And that's not to say that they're lesser compositions. It's just like a different branch somehow. What Sean was asking was just like that this thing exists on the main branch of 65, if you like. That this wasn't just 65 being composers for hire. This was like the next 65 Days of Static record. So as soon as that happened, we treated the thing very, very differently. Not that we would have been lazy otherwise, but the fact that it was going to be our next record as well, I don't know, it kind of, we approached it in a different way. We wanted to make sure that this would be a record that worked in its own right for people who, if people exist who think this is just the next 65 Days of Static record, who don't play computer games at all and have never heard of the game No Man's Sky, it's still going to be a perfectly good thing to own, a perfectly good experience.
Interestingly, Paul Welinski himself was far from an avid gamer when 65 Days of Static were approached by Hello Games. Since they were set to write music for their own body of work as much as a separate soundtrack, perhaps that helped the band avoid some of the tropes that pervade VGM. As diverse and colourful as game audio has been over the years, it's undeniable that a few lazy habits have developed along the way too. What was it about No Man's Sky's development that demanded a different approach instead of more common formulas?
I used to play loads of games as a teenager, but it was quite a big gap for me. So coming back to No Man's Sky was a huge learning experience, not just for making soundtracks, but just sort of seeing where the games world was at since 15 years ago or whatever. I remember, I think it was Paul Weir telling us that if it's a game like Grand Theft Auto or something, then you're going to have a little small, maybe not a whole city to run around in, but there'll be a little small district will be made and will exist as like a little playground, I guess, where you can start testing out ideas or whatever if you're still throwing things into it. But for No Man's Sky, it didn't really work like that, because I think that everything was interconnected and there was no consistency until it was all there. Changing a single seed or weighting of parameters within the ecosystem of the universe would have this huge ripple effect, and the next time you kind of went into the game, everything was totally different. And so I think it was incredibly ambitious, and I think it's still kind of talked about in those terms from a game development point of view now, like what they were trying to achieve. And as a tiny little team somewhere else, they were struggling with that. So for us, I mean, it was great that we didn't have to worry about any of that. It just meant that we didn't really have the kind of hands-on time that I think maybe you might get otherwise.
Almost everything about 65 Days of Static's process for No Man's Sky was different to most composition for games, partly because of the group's background, but also to better suit how the game actually works. Together with a heavily procedural leaning, there aren't many, if any at all, true cutscenes to grip into. Without standard scoring techniques as a crutch, there was a period of experimentation before landing on the right mood, and the band had remarkably little to go on at first.
As far as I understand it from talking to other games composers and seeing how it's normally done, the big difference for us was that because of the nature of No Man's Sky, because the whole thing was procedurally generated, that there were far less scripted events. Well, there were no scripted events in the way that there normally would be in a game. There were certain moments that they knew that every player would hit, like the first time that their spaceship takes off and leaves the planet, the first time they dock at a space station or whatever. These moments which would happen, but they would never happen in exactly the same way. You know, there was never a kind of cinematic cutaway or anything. So we didn't have anything concrete to actually score. It was all pretty abstract. That took a while to get our heads around. We really just had concept art and, you know, some video footage that was mostly the stuff that was in trailers and so on. But given how strong the game's aesthetic was and its design, that was kind of enough, you know. It was quite nice. It was quite nice in a way to not, once we got used to it, to not be locked down or tricked into soundtracking specific events. It was more like just focusing on the mood that we were trying to get across. Once we kind of got stuck in, it was actually quite a nice thing to do, like to sort of trust in ourselves, trust that we could do this certain type of sound quite well, and that there was definitely room within it to still make it fresh, both for ourselves and also as a kind of one part of a bigger aesthetic, which was the game.
Though No Man's Sky was their first, and so far only, game project, 65 Days of Static weren't new to mixing their music with science fiction imagery. In 2011, their alternate soundtrack for Silent Running was first performed live, before a studio recording released later that year. Silent Running is an acclaimed cult sci-fi film, directed by legendary visual effects master Douglas Trumbull, the inspiration for my guinea pig's name. Its aesthetic is closely related to his celebrated work on such classics as 2001, A Space Odyssey, Blade Runner, and Close Encounters of the Third Kind. 65 Days of Static's reimagined score for Silent Running shows a great love for famous science fiction soundtracks, melding instantly recognisable elements like arpeggiated synths and ghostly pads, with their existing palette. Since No Man's Sky is itself pure sci-fi, how much did Paul Welinski and his bandmates consider established takes on the genre?
I suppose to some degree or another, that kind of music and those kind of ideas has always informed our music to a small degree, but at the same time, the fact that they were getting us on board to do the soundtrack rather than any number of identikit Hans Zimmer wannabe composers, and there's a time and a place for Hans Zimmer. He can be fantastic, but that's clearly not what they were going for by hiring us, And so while we let that while we sort of embraced it to a degree, there's probably a lot more arpeggiated synths and big filter sweeps than we might have put in a 65 record otherwise. We didn't let that overtake the urge to sort of make it our own.
As a band, 65 Days of Static are known for their keen interest in technology and electronic music as it is. Simon Wright, predominantly the band's bassist, is a particular driving force in their exploration of synthesized sound. Their discography has integrated more and more with each release, so synths were always likely to take a key role on a soundtrack project. No Man's Sky is the perfect game for those leanings, but what kind of equipment did the band members use throughout the recording sessions?
None of it was that fancy because we don't have any cash to buy fancy instruments, but there's quite a few homemade synths. Simon, the bass player and synth wizard, has built a few because that's the kind of thing he can do. We're not purists in a kind of equipment sense because we've learned that you don't really have to be. There's always ways of getting your idea across, even if you don't have access to the stuff that you'd really like. The last record before No Man's Sky that we did was called Wild Light in 2013, and that was a big step forward for us in terms of production. We felt really kind of took a big step forward compared to the earlier records in terms of our sort of attention to sound design and the sonic palettes and production at a different point in the songwriting process, and that meant that, or part of that meant that although we've always been a very electronic band, we made a much greater effort to basically get every electronic thing out of the computer and back in again through something, and that something was usually distortion pedals and guitar amplifiers, and sort of embracing the fuzz and the hiss and the kind of deterioration of the synthetic sounds that inevitably followed from that. That's a thing that is a lot of fun to do, and a thing that we're getting better at. Every single synth sound within that record will have been re-recorded through a guitar amp, or at least through a series of guitar pedals, rather than just being, written in Ableton Live and always staying in that digital domain. So yeah, that kind of, it means that even if a cheap plugin can be made to sound good, you don't need to spend $6,000 on a vintage analog synth. I mean, it'd be nice to do that, but we didn't.
When it comes to technology, experiments with synths had already been a part of the band's catalogue. But the big difference with their first interactive score was the generative music system that came with it, something that the group's members saw as an attractive challenge. A handful of looping tracks would inevitably get dull to any player of any game, but that feeling's only intensified when there's a whole universe to play with. Since much of No Man's Sky relies on procedural generation, like planets, creatures, NPCs, ships, and so on, its music solves its own unique problems in the same way. By remixing and rearranging a finite set of recordings on the fly, the game achieves a remarkably organic sound that feels somehow endless. When did such a system become part of the process, and in what ways did 65 Days of Static adapt to it?
That didn't actually come immediately for us. When we were starting to have these meetings with Sean and Paul, they were saying, like, by the way, we want to make this like an infinitely long responsive soundtrack. You don't have to worry about any of that. You just go away and write your music and give it to us, and we will, we can turn it into something that it needs to be for the game. But obviously we were like, no, that sounds fascinating. We kind of would like to be involved with that if possible, and so we were eventually. But the kind of just the whole timeline of things meant that we did have to write the bulk of the material first, and in hindsight that was very, very useful, because it meant that we had a huge library to draw upon. We weren't doing everything from the ground up within the generative systems that came a little bit later. We did have kind of themes and sound palettes and so on. The main difference between writing a record and writing for this was that because we knew something was coming down the line in terms of making this like generative and responsive. When we were writing the album and the songs, we collected everything, like all of the offcuts, all of the abandoned ideas that are kind of associated with any song. We kind of kept all of it and started creating these libraries for every individual song. Then there was a big kind of bit of downtime for us, because we'd made the record. We made the record more than, it was mixed and mastered more than a year before the game was actually released. So the record obviously wasn't released until the game was released. So the Hello Games people were, working night and day for 2 years or something around this time, tirelessly. Whereas we actually had this big gap. And so we used that gap to start, I suppose, speculating on what this generative music system might be.
With the music left in the able hands of 65 Days of Static, it was Paul Weir's job to design the actual generative system they wrote for. Unlike the band, who were more used to live shows and studio albums, Paul already had years of diverse game projects under his belt. Some of his earliest credits include audio for such cult classics as Glover and the Discworld series, but he's more recently worked on certain LEGO games, and is well respected for his own production company, Earcom. Paul Weir has proved invaluable to No Man's Sky since its development, and he's continued to be deeply involved in updates since.
Well, I've been involved in kind of designing generative music systems a few times now. I'm not a programmer at all, but I have some really good programmers that I work with. And I guess I'm reasonably good at defining projects and kind of building new tech. I mean, I enjoy building new tech. And communicating with programmers in terms of, how they need to approach it. So I don't have a problem building a generative music system for No Man's Sky, and it seemed like such an obvious title to do it for. Myself and Van discussed kind of the structure of the music that they had to supply beyond just the normal linear album tracks. So that was where it's much more modular, really kind of broken down into individual components, and lots of variations of the work they'd already done. So they'd probably finished the album, again, probably, I guess, about 6 months before we started on Magenta music from them. So for them, it was about going back into the tracks, kind of breaking it all apart, creating kind of new music based on the original tracks. And then from my side, kind of with a lot of urgency, taking all those assets from them and putting it into the game, kind of checking everything, applying our rules, and putting it into the game.
In essence, we know that Paul's generative system worked by taking masses of individual recordings from 65 Days of Static and arranging them in appropriate, pleasing ways as the player explores. But a lot of thought and planning is necessary in order to pull that off in a satisfying way. The system follows an intricate set of rules, and the band had to consider that in their recordings. The result has become known as No Man's Sky's infinite music machine, which constantly churns and breathes in the background of your discoveries. Where most games with interactive music transition and fade between stems, usually whole pieces of music played on a single instrument or in a small group, the infinite music machine focuses even closer on isolated elements.
It wasn't really stems in the way that I think most games would use stems. We recorded raw audio, really. So, like the real kind of fundamental ingredients. We recorded a lot of bowed cymbal, actually. But that wouldn't be like a stem which was called cymbal stem. It would be 20 or 30, 10 to 20 second long WAV files, each kind of EQ'd and made nice and catalogued as here's some bowed cymbals, or here's set A of bowed cymbals, and there might be, I've done it a dozen times with one microphone and a dozen times with another. Like there was so much of this. So it was less kind of, I don't know, if you were doing sort of like, I think it's called vertical mixing or something in computer games, where you might have half a dozen stems, but they're not all always audible at the same time, and they're mixed in and out depending on what's going on in the game. Some are like high tempo and some are calm, but they all sort of sit together time-wise, and the melodic content always makes sense. What we did was nothing like that. It had moments that were a bit like that, but more often than not, it was this just this mass of audio that was, each piece had its own little metadata attached to it, and there was a brain that was kind of picking and choosing.
It's not a horrifically complex tool at all. Really, it's kind of not that much more than a sophisticated random file player with some kind of rules based around that. But the point of that system was, first of all, to build it from a very pragmatic approach. So to build enough to achieve what we wanted, no more, and that's kind of always been my attitude. I think a lot of software projects, particularly in kind of the game audio field, get into trouble because you look at all the possibilities and try and over-engineer, and then kind of end up with issues. Fortunately, I think it works reasonably well. I think it more or less achieved our aim, which is to have a soundtrack which sounded like them, but at the same time kind of avoids this constant looping of tracks. Probably most ambitious, not probably the most ambitious audio technology we developed was for the creature vocals. With I think moderate success. I'm pleased with what we got. For sure, it could be better, but it was definitely a challenging one to develop for.
In the majority of games, audio for NPC creatures and wildlife consists of set sound samples, taken either from libraries or occasionally direct recordings of animals and even skilled voice actors. No Man's Sky's various procedural possibilities for fauna across its 18 quintillion planets are basically countless, and unlikely to ever be completely logged. Therefore, like the music, the best option seemed to demand a generative edge. Otherwise, you'd soon start hearing the exact same samples for wildly different species on opposite ends of a virtual galaxy.
Normally when I approach a big project like this, I kind of look for what are going to be the most problematic areas. Usually it's a certain type of sound, and it could be that the game's set in a certain location, and that's really hard to achieve in an easy way. Or it could have like lots of weapons, so then you know you're going to have to record weapons, and that's a challenge in itself. So for No Man's Sky, like creature vocals was obviously going to be a problem, because we knew they were going to be procedurally created creatures. And your options are basically record loads of material. Yes, you could use animals, but that's hard and expensive and difficult to record animals. So you could get a human performer to do it, and that's a completely valid way of doing it. But again, you're dealing with lots and lots of content if you're going to cope with a range of creatures. So I did want to try doing it synthetically. And it wasn't like a wild stab in the dark. Physically modelling vocal tracks is a known thing. It's done in medical science. There's a couple of synthesizers out there who do something similar-ish. It's kind of one of the more slightly easier audio things to model. The challenge for us was, can we make it sound kind of good enough that players will accept it? Can we do it with low enough CPU to actually have it running and not get programmers complaining? And can we build it to be cross-platform?
Paul eventually whittled his ideas down to workable software, Vocalien, along with Sandy White, who my old school listeners may recognise for an output that stretches all the way back to the ZX Spectrum. Vocalien is a remarkable plugin that allows No Man's Sky's creatures to express a far wider range of character and emotion than sample libraries or performances practically offer. It can even be physically played, and Paul is surprisingly adept at producing convincing roars from a tablet alone. How was Vocalien incorporated into the final game?
I have a programmer called Sandy White, who is quite an industry veteran. And he's kind of my hardcore DSP programmer, really clever guy. And so we kind of sat down, we kind of designed it on paper, and in principle it was going to work. We were pretty confident we could physically model it. So in fact we had it like a prototype running really early on, kind of in VST form. So that kind of like ticked that box. And then the rest of the work was much more kind of the drudge of actually getting to run in the game with WIs, and the aspect which proved kind of more challenging than anything else was and this where it's similar to kind of the planet naming system, is what then performs the vocal system. So you can create the sound, but actually what drives the sound? What is it that's driving the sound? That's where, we had to build a whole kind of performance capture system using MIDI, so I had a control surface, so I actually kind of had to perform creatures, and then we use that as kind of like controller data to drive the synthesis model. And that was fiddly to get it working. And it does work, but it could have been, our approach would be different now from what we did then. I don't think I'm going to get this, but the one thing I would like to have done is to drive the vocal animation, mouth animation system from vocals. And there's no reason we couldn't have done that. It's just like we've never had the time or the opportunity to do that. And I think like one restriction of our system is that a lot of the vocalizations are quite short because the animations are quite short, so you don't always get the full character of the sound.
As Paul Weir tinkered away at perfecting the tools and systems behind No Man's Sky's audio, 65 Days of Static began a second phase of composition. Their first set of material for the game was, as Sean Murray requested, far closer to their preceding releases. Though chopped down to its constituent elements for use in the Infinite Music Machine, it features many more linear pieces, often saved for specific gameplay cues. When the band started writing for a second time, they did so with Paul Weir's generative systems far more prominent in their mind. They even played with designing a few of their own, using the time to catalogue as many recordings and as much knowledge as possible.
We knew that Paul Weir was down in Guildford with the computer game people designing it. We didn't really have access to that directly at any point. We had nice meetings with Paul Weir, and he'd come up to Sheffield where we were based sometimes. We went down a couple of times, but mostly we were quite remote. So in that period, that sort of between period, we did what, from our perspective, was like a second phase of writing, which ended up coming out as the second album of the soundtrack release. The first album being more song-like, and the second album is soundscapes. And those soundscapes were us writing as if we had this generative system to play with. So they were quite a good middle ground, because we were trying to think of music less linearly, not worried so much about having the kind of narrative structure that a more traditionally arranged song might have, not worried about them grabbing people's attention in quite the same way, because, you know, soundscapes and soundtracks aren't necessarily supposed to be in your face all the time. At the same time, we were learning how to develop our own kind of generative tools and responsive music systems in a kind of standalone way, so we'd be well practiced for when we started working with Paul to do the actual in-game stuff. At some time later, I guess this is probably mid to late 2015, you know, there's like the game had been getting developed and Paul Weir's audio system was up and running, and obviously that's much bigger than our score, because he was doing procedural creature noises and all of the spaceship noises and the whole sound design. So, you know, we were still just a very small subset of if even just the audio, never mind the whole game. When they were ready for us to join in, we were kind of presented with the parameters, basically, that had been established that the soundtrack could use, and then it was up to us to throw all of this raw material from the main record and from the Soundscapes record, like all of this material got thrown into the system, and then we recorded lots and lots more. There was back and forth with Paul Weir throughout this, and, you know, certain bits of logic when we kind of squeezed in there that we could use to make things a bit more musical.
It's interesting how two completely different professional worlds came together for No Man's Sky's audio, melding the composition and experimentation of 65 Days of Static with Paul Weir's high-level sound design. The two worked perfectly in tandem, and the Infinite Music Machine was quickly singled out as the game's most successful feature at release. It's true that 65 Days of Static excelled themselves for the project, but it was down to Paul Weir to give it context and meaning in the final release. As such, what did the procedural system look like from his perspective, and how did it achieve his aims?
It's a very streamlined system, but also kind of make it very easy to use, so that the process of adding audio files and applying rules to that and grouping them together and getting into the game was actually really straightforward. Like, that was a lot of the engineering task was based around that. We can allocate sounds. It could be single sounds, it could be groups of sounds. It doesn't matter how long they are. Actually put behaviors on them, put random properties on them, and then basically press a button. Our audio engine, which is WY's, it kind of sees all the content, and our music playback system sees all essentially XML files, which defines all the behaviors. So it's actually kind of a very quick process of adding content, adding the rules, and then getting it into the game. And the game itself will just pick up any new content we apply to it. There's very little, in fact there's no actual coding involved once we built the system to getting more music into it. We're very lucky from an audio perspective in the game in that the game itself doesn't stream very much, so that gives us the opportunity to basically stream from disk or from drive pretty well all the audio. On some games you have really hard limits in terms of memory as to what you have for audio, but we didn't have that on the No Sky. We could just keep creating music and not worry about limitations.
With all this talk of generative audio, what aspects of gameplay actually affect movement in the score? Outside of more obvious examples, like your first launch or warp, which generally use music from 65 Days of Static's first, more linear recordings, almost everything the player does is represented by some kind of audio. Clearer transitions occur in and out of battle, and as you enter or exit a planet's atmosphere, all of which have their own aural layers ready to take over if necessary. Such a practice is nothing new to VGM, but since each soundscape already bubbles with adaptive ebbs and flows of their own, moving between them is just another level of complexity.
So we had a planet soundscape, a space soundscape, a combat or action soundscape. That would form one set. So within that, usually there'd be consistency in terms of timbre, in terms of the kind of instruments you're using, and certainly in terms of key. But after a certain amount of time, it would change sets, and that didn't always apply. So, like the map music is totally different. There's different, certain specific situations. And I'm a big believer of let the composers compose. You can try and engineer a system to be super clever, but that's going to take a lot of effort. Whereas a human can do it really easily and quickly. So just let a human do it. So that's where I would kind of essentially mix, or probably more accurate, say arrange the soundscapes based on their suggestions.
We were always soundtracking to more abstract layers, like depending on how interesting things were, we would like these elements to come in, we'd like these elements to be removed, and so on. We prepared our soundscapes in that way. Each soundscape had an environment for being on a planet, or being in space, or being like in some sort of action mode, like whether you're being chased by a creature or in a dogfight in space or whatever. So like each soundscape had these three different modes, all of which would work together, and then within each mode there was half a dozen tracks, and each track would have it could have 30 or 40 samples within it. So it's this huge like mesh of sound.
They would give me like a text file going, these sounds go together, should be played at this level, don't play it against this or whatever, and I would interpret that and kind of build it for the system. We have really easy ways of saying if you're playing this, don't play that, or start playing more of this and combine it with this other instrument. So it actually was quite a creative process.
Oddly, if Paul Weir did a bad job of audio on No Man's Sky, it would be far more audible than the seamless results in the final release. Clunky transitions and poorly matched recordings would stick out like a sore thumb, but the Infinite Music Machine is delightfully subtle. On the other end of the scale, the tracks that 65 Days of Static wrote for key moments, like the game's opening, were deliberately direct. Chief among these is probably End of the World Sun, the dramatic conclusion of No Man's Sky's narrative. Without spoiling the considerably controversial ending for listeners, what set its composition apart from the rest of the band's soundtrack?
If you listen to any of our records, they tend to have kind of a big ending, you know, or the narrative structure of the record is something that we think about very carefully. Maybe that's a better way of putting it. And so, when you've got a record that's got all of these massive songs on it, then I think you kind of need to end either with something deliberately very quiet or something even more massive. And so for this record we went with the something even more massive option. And so that was kind of all happening, long before we knew if even the songs as songs were going to exist in the game at all. Like, for all we knew, this was all going to get pulled apart and, atomized and become this generative thing, and there would be no cues whatsoever. It's very nice that the songs, as they exist in themselves, have made it into the game too.
When 65 Days of Static were announced as writing the game's soundtrack, it's a safe bet that anyone aware of their work was excited to hear where they'd go with it. I'd already been a fan for some time, and as hype grew around No Man's Sky ahead of its release, there were yet another reason to buy the game. Despite that, both players and members of their own community were taken aback by just how well their music worked with No Man's Sky, and they went on to receive practically all of the warmest praise at launch. Ever since, and as I record this podcast, the band have released 2 full-length albums and a string of fascinating experimental projects, like A Year in Wreckage. Having not shown up in the game industry again, how much interest would the group have in scoring another title?
We haven't really met anyone else in the computer game world. We stumbled into this because we've just been around for long enough that someone who liked the band, eventually got into a position where they could make a computer game like this. So I don't know how you're supposed to do that exactly, and we're certainly not bored of being 65 Days of Static. We're going to continue doing that as well, but I think it would be good to do more projects. It'd be good to sort of try something where we aren't asked to be 65 Days of Static and can maybe try something that's a bit more outside of our comfort zone, because especially with generative music, because like I said, I think there's just a lot to explore there. But yeah, remains to be seen. There's nothing planned right now, but hopefully there will be in the future. "65 Days of Static's association with VGM
may have been short and sweet, but for Paul Weir, it's a career. As No Man's Sky has evolved into its current state, a far more impressive experience than its debut, Paul Weir's stayed on to helm its audio updates. Along with adding whole new sound design for elements like land vehicles and base building, Paul had a variety of new modes to tackle, and even new compositions. At the time of this podcast's release, it continues to be an important role, and one that's unlikely to dry up in a hurry.
Yeah, I've never worked on a project where there's been kind of ongoing updates. And all the updates have had kind of quite a lot of new audio content added. And sometimes it's fairly straightforward, that there's been new props added or base building. Sometimes it's kind of fundamental behind the scenes that you don't always see kind of what goes on, like a shift from having multiplayer and third person. But a lot of the audio is designed to be first person. And so we used a few shortcuts to make that happen. So getting it all to work and sound more or less the same in third person was a lot of work. Standing still takes a lot of effort. And there haven't been that many opportunities to really kind of push forward in the audio. But I am hoping, I'm not saying we're doing any future updates. Obviously we don't talk about future updates. But, I've not been wasting my time, so we'll see what happens. But it's been great to have the opportunity to revise the audio as well. And there's a lot of audio content in the game, and so I'm kind of in a constant process of mixing and remixing and trying to improve and going back and improving, but also trying to cope with the new elements that are constantly added to the game. So it is a balancing act.
As reflected in some of this episode's script, it's impossible to ignore the troubled reception that met No Man's Sky right out of the gate. But thanks to the grace of time and effort, it's now mainly brought up to help underline its surprisingly inspiring growth. In fact, its OST is probably the only major feature that hasn't seen vast changes outside of new content and updates. From the beginning, it sounded like the infinite universe that the game aimed for, cleverly mixing the different talents of 65 Days of Static and generative audio master Paul Weir. While modern VGM is ignored by some for its perceived lack of creativity, No Man's Sky sums up how sound design itself has changed, and lost none of its zest or individuality in the process.
I think the way that kind of game sound design has changed is that we've become more confident. For a long time, we always felt, I guess, kind of subservient to film sound design, lesser extent TV. We were always compared to that. But I think with the huge range of games and styles and genres, I think that the game audio voice is much more confident now than it has been.
The most exciting feeling for me after No Man's Sky was, unlike the music industry, which has been, slowly dying its death, for the entire time that we've been a band, and it's not a very happy place to exist in, really. The computer game world, full of really nice people and a slightly different way of doing things. I've certainly been lucky enough to work with Hello Games, in a little indie company that is putting creative decisions first and foremost. But once it was all over, it's just that feeling of existing in this world where there's actually untapped potential. There's so much new ideas to explore. There's so many things that genuinely haven't been done yet. And so with music and generative music, procedural music, it's barely getting started. And so it would be a real shame if the computer game industry, as it grows, shapes itself in the same way as the film and TV, and music kind of gets turned into an afterthought or hurriedly inserted with just these vague nods to interactivity, because if it's injected in an earlier stage, I think there's really interesting applications for it.
Thanks to both Pauls for speaking to me for the sound test, but thank you too for taking the time to listen. If you've enjoyed what you've heard, please make sure to subscribe or follow on whatever platform you might be listening on. There will be a new episode each week, right up until Christmas, where I'll be taking a short break before returning with the remainder of ST2. On next week's podcast, I'm joined by Laura Shigihara and Peter McConnell for a close look at the Plants vs Zombies series. It goes from Laura's beloved, colourful soundtrack for its first game, all the way up to Peter's work on its sequels and spin-offs, with heaps of great insight along the way. All my Patreon supporters gain early access to that episode, no matter how much they pledge. So head on over to patreon.com/_secret cave to offer your support and hear that episode right now. Of course, this doesn't apply if you're already a patron and hearing this episode in advance.
User initialization sequence complete.